Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. This is another one of the Commonwealth Club's online programs where we are discussing the work of several famous authors. And tonight we have with us David Bodanis, and he's coming to us direct from London. And we are going to be discussing many, many different books that he's written. But in addition to that, I wanted to talk about his work as a futurist, especially with the pandemic going on. It seems to me that businesses everywhere are under a particularly unusual stressor that's giving them an idea, and everybody an idea about what's necessary, what's not necessary, what's working, and also a little bit of how we all enjoy all these extra luxuries and services that everybody has been putting on, but they can disappear, and that really has a huge effect. So I know that this is part of your income stream, and so I don't want you to say anything that will cut into that. But if you could give us a little idea about how you think business is going to react to this in the future, and what you would predict for the future as a result of this.
It turns out there's people who are futurists and do scenarios. They try to be very vague about their predictions, for obvious reasons. However, I'm going to make an exception. I'm going to predict that tomorrow in the Financial Times, I'm going to have an article. It's true because we edited it today, and the editor told me it's in tomorrow.
Great.
And so the article's about exactly the question you raised.
Huh.
In chess, pieces, a lot of pieces move in a straight line or at an angle, but there's one piece, the knight, the horse, that moves in this really funny way. It moves, one direction and then veers to the side, and suddenly you end up in a different place. You always end up on a square of a different color. You can leap over things. You're not incredibly far away. It's not like the rook or the queen that can go the whole length of the board, but you're just in a slightly new position. And I thought, so the piece is called, it's about the knight's move. And all of us with the coronavirus are sort of in that position. A company won't go into an entirely different field. An energy company isn't going to start making hamburgers or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
However, an energy company or a restaurant chain or whatever will be forced to make this sort of night's move. In Silicon Valley, it's the famous pivot. People often start up selling something, it doesn't quite work, and they realize, say, their underlying technology is something that can be used in a different direction. They pivot, and it can do well. Twitter is a famous example. There's others, and usually that only happens under necessity. That only happens when you've really, really pushed hard in one field, and it's slowly gotten blocked. That famous phrase that you should reinforce victory and leave a defeat. Well, it makes sense, but when do you know that it's a defeat? If you
Mm-hmm.
have a startup or you have a division, it's not working that well. You don't want to be flighty. You want to really push on it. Anyways, now with the virus, all of us are forced to pivot. Almost all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I believe debt collectors are still doing fairly well. And there's some people on private islands in the Pacific. And before that, nobody liked them. And even now, nobody likes them. So they remain the same. But anyway, so we're all forced to be in this new setting. And you might say, well, there's bad things about being in a new setting. You don't have the exact same skill set before, you don't have the same contacts. On the other hand, there's wonderful advantages. Everybody else is sort of afresh. They're sort of in a new setting. Think, I don't know, of a Midwesterner who moves to London, like me. Suddenly, instead of being another corn plant in the Midwest, I have this. I'm not saying it's a superior perspective, but it's a fresh perspective.
Mm.
So if your firm or even just your division or even the way that you work is making you go into a slightly different domain, be it working from home or trying to sell a different product or using different financial instruments or just changing your service, well, you're kind of forced to do that and you have a fresh perspective. Because when you enter this new domain, you land on it. It's like landing on a new square on a chessboard, and you look around, but it's not that far from where you landed. So you have some of your skills applied, but you're doing it in a fresh and different direction. You have your old tools apply well in a fresh area. As you know, before writing about business and stuff, I used to write about science.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the great things that makes a good scientist a creative is when they can jump into a new field. Because when they jump into a new field, they bring their tools from the old field. They have this great advantage. Now, if you're stuck in the way, you say, this is the way we do it. It's never going to change. But if you're not that stuck in the way, you say, everybody here is doing this. Let me see if I can apply this other principle or this other tool. So for a brief moment, all of us will have this lovely, fresh advantage.
Yeah, and we'll see how long that moment lasts. I mean, it seems to me after 9/11, of course, there was a lot of reaction, a lot of fear, and that fear really hasn't completely gone away at all. We're still reacting with more fear than we did before. Um, but this seems to be an even bigger problem because then it was worrying about, the possibility of a terrorist attack, which is a very minor thing. This isn't a possibility. Everyone knows that this virus is spreading and that there's really some things we can do to slow it down, but nothing we can do to stop it yet. So it probably will have an even bigger effect. It's interesting to me what the businesses will have to do, and also how it will affect governments. And it's coming at not a good time in terms of even though we've been thriving, but there seems to be a lot of long-term issues that we've let fester underneath the surface that come out. As what was it, Warren Buffett that said, you find out who's been swimming without a bathing suit when the tide goes out. So it seems like a lot of that is going to go on. But is there any other element of that you think will drive business? Like some businesses, like online retailers, probably will do even better than before. For example, not just debt collectors. So I'm not going to ask you to give a stock tip. We'll go into some other ideas. But
Sure. No, no, but you're entirely right. So there's some which are happening now, which are the services that we need during this time, which are doing well. Online retailers,
mhm,
certain aspects of loans and certain aspects of insurance are quite important. There's interesting innovations going on with bonds and other sort of investments. But when we land in the new world, it'll be a little bit like the Knights move. It'll be similar, but not that similar. So, for example, 5 or 10 years after 9/11, in one sense, America was unchanged. Daily life had many similarities.
mhm,
On the other hand, there were things that were taken for granted: greater security at airports, a Department of Homeland Security, all sorts of other matters that became sort of second nature. And as you pointed out, this, in a sense, is larger than that one event, however extreme that event was. I like to think of it as if you take two stones, say flat stones from the bottom of a shallow river, and if you push them together medium hard, if one jerks off to the side, it flies a little bit. But if you push them really, really, really hard, and one flies off to the side, it's going to go a terrific distance.
mhm,
So the more intense the experience, the more intense the extreme the follow-ups will be.
mhm,
So uh, after a moderate political or environmental upset, you want security. On the other hand, you're willing to make a fresh start. Think of a tornado. I come from
mhm,
my mother's family was on a farm in Ohio in the famous tornado belt, southern Ohio.
mhm,
And after a tornado, on the one hand, people really they turn to their community, which is can be warm and supportive. They can also be angry at other people who survived the tornado,
mhm,
who weren't involved. So you can respond in different directions. And if it's an even greater effect, a greater impact, the effects will be greater. So after this, we can have a response, for example, like the one after World War One, where the U.S. really freaked about foreign dangers,
yeah,
the famous acts against what were called terrorists of the time, many of whom were totally innocent union organizers. Or on the other hand, you can have the response as there was set up during and after World War II in Britain and America, where you got the National Health Service in Britain and the GI Bill and things like that in America. But the intensity is great. It's sort of like in chemistry. There's an activation barrier, a sort of activation energy you have to cross. For example, when you light a match, you have to strike hard enough, which
mhm,
is why famously, if it's matchbox is wet or you're distracted, it doesn't ignite. But once you cross that threshold and it takes off, then it self-sustains. But the question is, what direction will it take off? Which direction will self-sustain after this? Clearly, people want a big change. It could be that we now are aware of the physical significance of the planet around us. It isn't something that you watch on a David Attenborough documentary
mhm,
or something you maybe notice if you go on a weekend away. It's something that really impinges. People are also getting some notion of feedback loops and how quickly exponential growth occurs. And so that could lead to a feeling of, wow, carbon is next. If this is what a virus can do in the feedback loops,
mhm,
who knows what carbon can do? Unleashing, say, methane from permafrost in Siberia and other places. On the other hand, some people might respond to the virus by saying, "I know what we have to do.
mhm,
Duh." We
Hmm.
have to attack everybody else who's not like us because that'll make things a lot better.
Right.
Luckily, the United States does not have leadership like that. Otherwise, I would be worried for the future.
um, yeah, you got me on that one. So it seems to me that a lot of, at least we've gotten a lot of cooperation throughout the world with this idea that we can shut down our economies in order to save our health. There's much more cooperation than I would have expected. There's
Yes.
certainly a lot of non-cooperation, and I think it also shows some of the similarities we have. For example, a lot of governments that we complain about are authoritarian governments that flirt with democracy. But we have a democracy that flirts with authoritarianism. And so it brings us a little bit closer together in terms of how we do things. Nobody really has given up on authoritarianism yet.
Mhm.
But we'll get to that idea a little later because in one of your ideas in Einstein's book, it's about observational democracy and that idea. And I want to get to that a little bit later.
Sure.
But if we go to Einstein's, I mean, I thought it was very bold of you, of course, to write a book called Einstein's Greatest Mistake. But I thought that was perfect, and it's actually exactly on point. And I was wondering while you were talking earlier whether from that book you took as part of your toolkit to the future stuff this idea that you can get stuck in an idea. You talk about him as someone who's a genius has to be both supple and innovative and also stubborn because usually they've got to push against a major
Yes.
idea for a long
Yes.
time. And if they don't
Yes.
get the balance just right, and you think his biggest mistake was that he got stubborn because of certain things. So if
Right.
you just tell that story a little bit, it's a great book. It's won lots of prizes and all that, and it's done very, very well. But it's a great story, and I think you tell it in a very different way than a lot of biographies of Einstein.
Oh, sure. So I'm very happy. Let me recount the story. And then at the end, if you can cue me and remind me that we can talk about analogies in politics today.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just hint at the analogy. In politics, have you noticed that when somebody comes into power, they'll often be very exciting and do stuff at the beginning, which often works, but then they get sort of stale. And one reason is to get into a high political position or the head of a company or the head of a state or whatever, you have to push really hard. And even if you have a good idea, you've pushed really hard. So when you're there, you implement the idea, but you've been so used to pushing hard in that direction that if it turns out the implications are such that it's beginning to not work very well, or that you should go in a different direction, it's really hard to change. Sort of like if there's been a car that's been revving really long and finally gets to move forward, it's going to be hard to turn at a 40-degree angle, let alone a 90-degree angle. Well, if there's a car moving more slowly, it's different. Anyways, so
Mhm.
that's the political analogy. So going
Yeah.
back to Einstein, Einstein was a bright boy. Um, to have one theory of relativity is good. He had two theories of relativity,
Hmm.
and he got the Nobel Prize not even for the theory of relativity. He was really awesome. At one point, in one of the most tired, exhausted moments of his life, he was in his late 30s in Berlin in 1916. He had just completed what we'll talk about in a moment, the general theory of relativity. He was beyond exhausted. He was in bed a lot. And he kind of came up one weekend with an idea which he published, which was maybe his 11th or 12th best idea. It was the idea behind the laser.
Hmm.
So his like 11th or 12th best idea when he was exhausted was the laser.
That's
So
not too
the man
bad.
was not too bad. It took him a while to get going. He knew he had fresh ideas. His little sister was thought he was terrific, and his mother thought, well, her son was absolutely terrific. And one of the things that helped him get going was that he was a bit of an outsider, but not too much of an outsider.
Hmm.
The great Rabbi Hillel once said that if you have a pile of logs that are burning, or pieces of wood that are burning, if you take one piece of wood away from the fire, for a brief moment, it'll flare up brighter than all the rest.
Hmm.
He didn't know about oxygen, but the effect is well known. However, if you keep it away for too long, after a while it dies down and becomes just cinders. It's nothing. Well, it's the same thing like that with good education and creativity. You need to be educated. Despite the common myths, Einstein actually did well at secondary school and he did quite well at university. By the way, I traced back the story where did people get the idea that Einstein was a terrible student?
Yeah.
And I tracked it back to the noted Einstein scholar Sylvester Stallone, who in Rocky One had his uh, uh, had his wife, the woman who played his wife or girlfriend or sister, say that Einstein had been a terrible student. I admire Stallone very much, both for what steroids can do and also for the quality of some of his films. But as an Einstein scholar, he's not up there in the first. So Einstein was a good student, but not an incredible student. What he had that was distinctive was two things. One is that he said he had the persistence of a mule.
Yeah.
When he was a little boy, when he'd make card castles, he'd make a layer of cards and then another layer on top of it and another on top of that. And if somebody opened the door and the wind knocked them over, he'd shrug, take his time, and start again.
Hmm.
Persistence of the mule. The other thing he had was this. We think of him as this funny old man, or like really wise, or slowly spoken. That's because his English was terrible. He was his French was almost as bad. It was really embarrassing. He tried once speaking Spanish. He said he would try to speak French and just put an O at the end of everything. Incomprehensible, but because he was Einstein, people respect it. Anyways, but he had this nice German Jewish sense of humor. The time when he was really at his peak was Berlin, 1920s, 19 teens. That was really his cool method, his cool era. And as an example of the humor, I can mention his younger sister, Maya.
Hmm.
When she and Einstein were little children, at one point he got really angry at her, and he got a big, heavy rubber ball and threw it at her and hit her in the head. And she wrote about that later, and she said, that shows it takes a thick skull to be the sister of a world famous physicist. And I love that sort of humor. It's you always can take a twist, come in from a fresh angle. So when Einstein was in his late teens and early 20s, he was a good student, and then he got a job at the patent office, which is very cool. People say it's a backwater, but imagine being the patent office in, say, in Silicon Valley, seeing the new stuff coming in.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. And he was into electrical engineering then, so it was really cutting edge. But it was hard to put his ideas together. And then suddenly, when he was around 24 and then around 25, it all came together. At one point, he said it was like an electric storm in his head. A thunderstorm had finally burst, and it was clear. The sky was clear afterwards. And I'd say for about 20 years, he was on a roll.
Hmm.
One good idea after another. And these were just terrific ideas, as good as anyone since Isaac Newton, and with much more personal charm also.
That was
But
one of
one
the
of the
things that
ideas,
you covered. Sorry, just to break in here, but that was one of the things you covered in the book that gave me a totally different view on Einstein. Because, as you said, we think of him as an old man. In fact, most people that are famous, if they live long enough, we get that impression of them that they're old men.
mhm,
But they do almost do all of their major work when they're in their 20s and 30s. And
correct.
you present him as having an open marriage and a lot of girlfriends and stuff like that. People don't think of Einstein that way. He was a charming guy that went out sailing and took ladies with him and so on and so forth.
Yes.
I thought that was a very different view of him. So
Yeah, he in that sense, he was a real person. I mean, his son
yeah,
used to drive him around on motorcycles outside of Berlin and stuff, and he was very cool on that.
yeah.
And when he did have affairs, at one point his housekeeper from this house that he had outside of Berlin on a lake where he kept his boat, the housekeeper was interviewed later, said, "Oh, Professor Einstein, oh, the ladies over there were always laughing. They had such a good time. They were so friendly."
Yeah,
And he was perfectly polite to his wife. He didn't, and he was really kind to his wife.
yeah.
At one point, his son said about Einstein's second wife, not it was so the stepmother of the son. When the son was a young adult, he said, "Dad, Elsa's not really a brain box, is she?" And Einstein said, "Well, maybe she's not a brain box, but she has a good heart. She's a good person."
Yeah,
So he really respected her. But he just had the dignity to keep his affairs separate.
yeah.
Anyways, but the key idea that drove him. So he had the persistence, and he came in from a fresh angle with that humor. Instead of, if any problem was posed that people were stuck on, he would try to come in at a different angle. But the core idea underlying much of what he did was this notion that was centuries old in the West, which is that everything has a clear, rational, logical explanation. That if I might be confused, but if I get really down into the details, I can see things that are happening really clearly. And if I can't see things really clearly, well, it's a fault because we don't have the good enough, the sophisticated enough concepts, or we don't have enough technical tools. An example there. So we feel that way, say about family therapy. We feel if there's a problem inside a family, if we really could understand the root causes, we could see clearly what it is.
Yeah.
somebody has these sorts of issues, or somebody was traumatized, and often that's the case. So in much of the Einstein's work with relativity and his work with many other matters, he did really well taking this approach. And then, as indeed you know, George, especially in the 1920s, a lot of physicists began to think that on the super microscopic level, on the famous quantum level, things were different. That the movement of certain electrons, these little particles inside atoms, were just almost random. We couldn't predict exactly how they were going. We could describe what they were doing, and we could maybe give a probability that they moved in a certain way, but that we couldn't find the details. And Einstein thought, well, that's fine. We've been there before many times. It's just that if we had better microscopes, perhaps we could see better, or if we had like better analytic tools. Think
Mm.
of trying to understand a family before you had, say, Freudian understanding, or many of the later therapists and stuff. So Einstein was open-minded about this. He said, "Oh, just we don't have enough details," and many scientists believed him in the mid 1920s and late 1920s. But then it became more and more clear. The evidence became clearer and clearer that it wasn't like that at all. That if you really stared really, really hard at this detailed level, you would never be able to find something clear. That it was the nature of things was to have these sort of sudden jolts that we couldn't predict. Now, many people, almost everybody, one of the people that Einstein was friends with was a young physicist named de Broglie, who, when he was young in the 1920s, I didn't exist. But when de Broglie was an old man in the 1970s, I was a youngster living in Paris, and I got to meet him. He was a prince, and
Uh,
literally a prince. And I got to meet him at his beautiful townhouse in Paris. And he described one time when he and Einstein were at the Gare du Nord, the train station in Paris, and de Broglie had just come back from a conference. He was one of the last people still believed with Einstein that everything could be clear and rational, and there'd be no sudden gaps, that if there were sudden jumps, it was just a limitation of our understanding. But he began to think, no, it's not like that. It's different. And he said to Einstein, look at the experimental evidence. It's really clear. And Einstein paused and he said, can you really trust the experiments? And that leads into the second part of my book. I won't go into the details of
yeah.
it now. We have much to cover, but very briefly, in a different field, in the field of cosmology, dealing with large structures in space and time, Einstein had once made a prediction, and all the experimentalists in the world said, "No, your prediction's wrong." So he said, "Are you sure?" This was the famous
Right.
and they said, "Yeah, it's unambiguous." For example, in this particular case, Einstein had predicted from his theory that the universe would be expanding.
Right.
And all the greatest scientists in the late 19 teens said, no, sorry, unambiguous, the universe is static. There's our galaxy, and outside is a large void, sort of like the brains of certain political leaders that we're aware of today, just with like the magnetic fields, sound and fury signifying very, very little. And Einstein said, "Are you sure?" They said yes. So he cancels his theory. And then about 10 years later, Hubble in California and others showed that the experiments were wrong. In fact, the universe is expanding. Einstein apparently said, so that was my greatest mistake, the biggest blunder of my life. So he resolved he wasn't going to be burned again.
Hmm.
If he had simply stuck to his guns about cosmology, about the expansion of the universe, he would have been proven right. He just had to take a deep breath and wait 10 years. So he felt deep inside, he felt the, the microscopic structure of the world has to be super clear. It has to be rational and with no sudden jumps. And although the evidence seems to be against me, well, once before the evidence was against me, and I made the mistake of not sticking to my principles. This time I'm going to stick to my principles. And until he died, which was 30 years later, he lived into his 70s, he still thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd be redeemed by history. That someday, perhaps after his death, people would find that he'd been right to stick to his principles. In this one case, sadly, the great Albert Einstein was wrong.
No. Uh, it's it's the principle that he had of cause and effect, as you wrote it, that he was relying on and sticking to. Um, it's interesting because he did early work on photons and the wave particle, what became wave particle duality theory. And before I go there, one of the things that's very interesting about the fact of the galaxy, our galaxy, that we've only known for 100 years that
Correct.
there's something besides the Milky Way. All our scientists thought the Milky Way, that was it. That was the whole universe. And it's now trillions of times larger or something like that, right? So we should be a little bit modest about whether we've come to the end of our information, that we can collect. But in thinking about that wave-particle duality, I think if we were huge, much bigger than the solar system, and the Earth was not seeable by us, so that it was outside of our thing, but we had a theory about the Earth, and the Earth was a particle that moved in a wave around the sun, and since the sun is moving, then the Earth is a particle moving around. And we had that all down, and we said, okay, it's going to be like this, and it all came out, except for there were some times when the Earth particle was outside the wave that we predicted, right?
Yeah.
And we didn't know what to do about that. And maybe we didn't know about the moon. Like the moon was not in our theory. And the moon
Correct.
would be enough to move the Earth particle outside of its wave function.
That's exactly it. What you're describing is called the hidden variable theory.
Right.
The notion that the things that seem mysterious jumps, correct, we're noticing jumps, but they're only mysterious because of lack of our understanding. Unfortunately, experiments, both ideas and then practical experiments after Einstein's death, made it clear that the hidden variable theory in this case doesn't hold.
Doesn't
That
hold
there
up.
is no such thing as a little moon bouncing it around. But you see how plausible it was for him to believe in
Exactly
that.
what I was saying, yeah.
Yes, and again, without comparing everything back to business or politics, you can see that many people, when their businesses are stretched, they say, "Okay, come on, it's going to be it went down, it's going to come up. We'll go back where we were. We'll do what we did before, but even better." If
Mhm.
we had a certain, say, a bookstore and a physical bookstore, and we had a good selection and good outreach with the community, we'll have even more outreach with the community and more hands-on selling and stuff, hoping that what worked in the past will work in the future. In some cases, that really holds. For example, like speaking loudly to a child, sometimes will get the child's attention. But as we know, there comes a point when it doesn't work.
No, and what you say, I mean, I did mergers and acquisitions as a lawyer for many, many years, and most CEOs of the company that's buying the other company assumes that just with good leadership, all their problems can be solved. And
Yeah.
of course,
Yes,
they
that's
are
it.
the good leadership, and the
Yes.
statistics do not back them up.
Well,
Sometimes it works, yeah.
I suppose probably in M&A, that would be one of the emotionally hard things for people to accept.
Mm.
To think that, oh, I'm setting up something which is exciting to set up, plus lucrative, and statistically it might not be. It's like likely not to work. Did you? Uh, I know we're talking in my direction, but I'm actually fascinated.
Mm.
Did you find any analogies there when people stuck to it past evidence?
Uh, no, never, because the CEOs all believe in themselves. Not all, but you have to believe in yourself a lot to end up being a CEO of a big company. And so
Makes sense.
rarely, I have some funny stories, but we can't go into all those. They're just too funny. But I agree with you that factual, facts don't ever get in the way of the theory if the human psychology is behind the theory.
Mhm.
And so I don't think that really. And enough of them work, 35, 45. I think it's a minority, but somewhere in that range, it comes out to have a positive effect on the overall thing. So there's enough success that, if you took most of these people were, in the top 4 or 5% of their classes, that kind of thing. So if you tell them
Mhm.
there's a 35 or 45% chance that you can make this work, they say, well, I'm certainly in that range. I'm in the top 10%, so it is not a problem.
Sure.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I think
I
it hasn't really
yeah.
gotten in their way at all, those facts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose one of the things about the coronavirus is that it's actual reality. You can't manipulate away from it.
Right.
So in the short term, people who either don't tell the truth or lying is an extreme word. People who want to believe that, yeah, I always nailed it before. I always managed to be in like the top 3 or 4% or
Right.
1% of my class. I can do it again. It's when there's sharp, brutal reality that it blocks you. I remember once when my kids were in secondary school, one of their friends was at the airport
Mm.
and was flying from London to America, and they needed a visa with a 3 month. They needed a British passport that still had 3 months to go, and their passport, not my kids, but this other friend, the passport only had something like 2 months and 3 weeks to go.
Mm.
So the person at the airport said, "Oh, sorry, you can't get on the flight."
Uh,
And the kid said, "Oh, well, that's okay. We'll phone my dad. He'll work it out. He'll speak to the school, and stuff." And he wasn't a braggart. It's just that's what you do. And he said, "No, no, you don't understand. You can't come on the flight."
yeah.
And the truth, he had never met that brute reality. People who've dealt with floods sometimes feel the same exasperation and exhaustion. For my latest book, I interviewed some military leaders, who had actually had to deal with flood relief and stuff
Mhm.
like that. Well, a physical opponent at times will get tired. A physical opponent will have a psychology. And even in the short term, unless it's like, I don't know, a nuclear war, you can often spin it a certain way. But floodwaters never stop. It could be 2 in the morning. If the pressure is going and the sandbag's going to burst, it's going to burst.
Mhm.
And it's utterly remorseless. You can't talk your way away from it. You
Yeah.
can't spin away. You can't say, well, maybe this time the laws of physics will be different. Sadly, it's not.
Well, the other interesting part about this crisis, for me anyway, and for international business, is that there are going to be labs all around the world that are working on the vaccine, working on antibody tests, and all that kind of thing. And the best ones will probably rise to the top pretty quickly. And that will show that the spread of education across the whole planet has been an extremely useful thing to everybody because it's going to speed up the recovery by several years probably. And I
Yes.
just think that
Yes.
that's going to be a very, like you said, reality. The reality is that we have this foe that we really can't talk out of anything, but we can maybe outsmart. That's
Yes, and that's beautiful. So, in many of the disaster movies that people watch, which I
right.
love and stuff, I sit on the sofa and veg out. There's always these scenes where international councils get together and a lab somewhere else or a bright youngster somewhere else intervenes, and people kind of like it. In the way that in romantic comedies, remember, comedies always have to end usually with a fertility ritual,
Right.
and before the couple get together in romantic comedies, the crowd usually helps them. So the crowd joins together and
Right.
carry somebody past difficult traffic or lift somebody along and stuff. And we love that. We love the notion of people coming together, even if we're cynical and
Yeah.
don't believe it all the time. If we, at the moment, the coronavirus is a work in progress, certainly mankind's responses. But if it turns out that there's international collaboration to make the end work, people, that's going to be very, very hard to break down. In the same way, in 1945, it's almost inconceivable in Britain or America or the Netherlands or Norway to think that international collaboration isn't the way forward. Clearly, that's you couldn't have survived
Right.
against Germany without it. So you might want to make sure that the United Nations works better than the League of Nations or the World Health Organization was set up at that time, and some precursors for the World Trade Organization. You want to make sure they work well, but the idea was sort of unquestioned because you had seen it operating.
Right.
So I would love, so now after this, if we say, oh, should we support education around the world? Should we have bright people come to Stanford or Cal Berkeley and then move back and forth?
Hmm.
The answer is, my God, yes.
Yeah.
We want them available. We want them all kind of sharing. So that's one way it can spin out. Of course, if the collaboration doesn't work that way, or if it does and people are being malevolent, they'll try to spin it in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. Now you're great in all of your books about science, telling human stories like you just did here and bringing it to the human level. And I wanted to mention two because I thought they were both great stories. One was about Henrietta Leavitt, about how she discovered the Cepheid stars, and then with her calculations, and that really gave us the size of the universe in the early 1920s, something like that. And
Mhm.
maybe just tell her story a little bit because she got the usual treatment women got at the time.
Yeah, yeah. It's really sad. You read about injustices, and then you read about injustices,
Yeah.
and one of the pleasures of being of writing about history is you get to redeem the past. Admittedly, it's not as good as going back into the past, intervening and making it better. I would have. I always. I was once asked on a program somewhere else if I could go back, what would I do? And one thing would be, can you imagine showing Nelson Mandela in his prison cell a headline from 25 years in the future of what was going to happen, the good
Right.
things, just to hold the faith, just to know it's going to be in there or something, or
Yeah.
people in the civil rights movement to know what was ultimately going to happen. So anyway, so Henrietta Leavitt was a woman in the early 20th century who had a peculiar job title. It turns out in the 19 teens and 20s, computers weren't electronic devices. Computers were people who sat down and computed.
Hmm.
And it was low paid, and they were usually women. So
Hmm.
she worked for an observatory based in Harvard. And what the sad thing is, her boss, he wasn't a sexist monster. He wasn't like Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
He was a decent person who would be fairly friendly. But the assumption was that women were much lower cogs in the machine.
Mm.
It'd be like somebody who's never rude to a servant, but just assumes, well, you're inherently a servant.
Yeah.
There's no way you can be educated like my old children. So that was Leavitt's position, and she was given one of the dull jobs of categorizing the brightness of different stars in our galaxy, and they were beginning to get telescopes to see into other galaxies. And she noticed something quite wonderful.
Mhm.
Sometimes at night you can't quite tell how far away a light in the sky is. Is it an airplane really far away, or is it some sort of like a kid's balloon that's nearby? You can't tell. But suppose airplanes all had, or suppose it's like is it like a small airplane nearby, or is it a big airplane far away?
Mhm.
But suppose every airplane flashed its lights on and off at a certain fixed rate,
Mhm.
and then you would be able to tell. Oh, I see. If it's really bright, I know that it's close, and if it's far. Sorry, how to explain it super clearly? So suppose I know that at a distance of say 3 miles, it's going to have a certain brightness
Mhm.
because it's flickering at a certain rate. And I say, oh, I see. That's the one that's going to have level 10 brightness at 3 miles.
Mhm.
Well, if it's flickering at that rate and the brightness is greater, I know it's closer. If it's flickering at that rate and the brightness is less, I know it's further.
Mhm.
So it's a way of using a measuring stick. And in this case, instead of just measuring the distance of an airplane in the sky above you, she could measure the entire universe.
Mhm.
She found that there were certain stars that were sort of like a pan of porridge, to use the sticky English glutinous word. And if you have sticky porridge, oats and stuff, it bubbles up, and it sits. The bubbles are below the surface, and then bloop, you get the surface leaps up and stuff. Well, there are certain stars called Cepheid variables where they're constructed like that. There's this very roughly. This is just an analogy. Pressure and tension builds up, and then ooh, there's an eruption of bright colors and it goes down. And they do it on certain cycles. And she was able to find what the absolute brightness of these were.
Mhm.
So if the cycle was like every 10 days they went up and down in brightness, she knew the absolute brightness was say a level 5.
Mhm.
So that meant, wow, if there was one that had this cycle of 10 days and it was much brighter than level 5, that meant it was really close. And if it was much dimmer than level 5, then it was far away.
Mhm.
And she was able to measure some that were really dim, but they were at this level that they seemed to be producing a lot of brightness. So if there's something that you know is producing inherently a lot of brightness, but it's really dim, you can only draw one conclusion. Like suppose you know that fireflies always have, I don't know, say, I don't know, a 3 watt output.
Mhm.
I know they don't, it's much less,
Yeah.
but suppose they do. And then you see what's clearly a firefly, but it's only giving like a tenth of a watt output. So you think, gosh, I must be seeing that firefly from really far away.
Mhm.
She did her calculations. Do you know where this star was? It was a different galaxy.
Mhm.
She'd been able to find the distances. She was able to find the distance between galaxies. She's the one who, as much as anybody, helped understand that the shape of the universe isn't our galaxy and then a void,
Mhm.
but our galaxy and then another galaxy. And then, of course, you do the analogies going further. This was really impressive. It turned out she also had a disability. She was hard of hearing, and after a while, she was totally deaf.
Mhm.
She had a wonderful response to her disability. It was called "So What," which I thought was a really nice response. They always say it takes two people to make you feel bad about yourself. One person saying insulting things, and the other person you to accept it.
Yeah.
She didn't accept it. She got much of her research. She had to do it in outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and she was using slides that came from Harvard had a large a telescope at that point in Arequipa in Peru. She never got to Peru. She always used to dream about it. Maybe she could go there. Maybe she could help the astronomers.
Yeah.
Maybe she could suggest new things to do. And her lab director said, "No, no, 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 no. It's not for women." Anyways, after she died, her best friend from the lab, a woman, sailed down to South America, landed in Peru, took the train up to Arequipa, and went to the observatory. And she wrote in her journal, "Oh, I'm seeing the stars, just what my friend Henrietta would have loved." And now Henrietta lives.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a wonderful story. Thanks for sharing that. And the other one, totally different. I want to go from Henrietta to Madame du Châtelet next, but with this one little detour before we leave Einstein's friends. Um, Niels Bohr and George de Hevesy were in a boarding house.
Yes, I love it.
They said like a frat boy's trick on their landlady, and I don't think it was just such a great thing what they did. They didn't
Yeah.
like the.
So this was in the 19 teens. Niels Bohr was Danish. He apparently spoke one language in any, whether he was speaking English or Danish or French or whatever, he would speak really bad slow Danish, but just for these different reasons. And apparently even in Danish he was nearly indecipherable. But he was a lovely man. Everybody liked him. He was a young man. His brother was a great soccer player and on Denmark's Olympic team. There's a story, I couldn't track it down, so it's probably apocryphal, that says brother of soccer star wins important physics prize. When Niels Bohr has the Nobel Prize. But
The
sadly, that's
soccer
not.
attitude on everything.
Yeah, yeah. But anyways, but the following story about Niels Bohr and George de Hevesy is actually true. I managed to trace it down.
Hmm.
So when they were living in a boarding house in, I think it was in the north of England in the late 19 teens, it was a cheap boarding house, and they were convinced the butter was being recycled.
Hmm.
And but like not just from one day to the next, but for green, rancid, smelly butter and stuff. Well, de Hevesy's research, for which he decades later got the Nobel Prize, was little radioactive tracers. You put a little fragment of a chemical into something, and it slowly decays at a certain rate, which you can measure with either Geiger counters or the equivalent of Geiger counters. So he put some in the butter and didn't tell anybody. And then he went away. A week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, he measured the butter. It was still in there, slightly decaying. I'm convinced that the English landlady at the time drew from this the conclusion: do not let foreigners, and specifically not foreign physics students, into your boarding house
Come to
again.
wait. Yeah, it seems like such a perfect physics frat joke to play on your landlady.
Oh,
Um,
actually, can I mention just briefly another one, which was sadly more significant?
uh,
So Niels Bohr had a great research lab in Copenhagen for a while. It was one of the world's greatest. And he had a number of Nobel laureates there, and many of them stored their gold medals there. Several of them were Jewish, and they knew that in World War II there was going to be trouble. So some of them, Niels Bohr himself was half Jewish. Some of them escaped, but what do you do with the gold medal? So what they did in Bohr's lab, true story, they dissolved it in acid. So when Heisenberg and the other like German officials came by, they just saw a dull lab with wooden shelves, and there were jars of these sort of brownish liquid
mhm.
sitting around. Nobody thought that's where the Nobel Prize was because it's an important gold medal. After the war, they precipitated it out and got the same amount of gold. So that was a clever way of hiding it.
Yeah, I love it. I wanted to make sure that they got the gold back. That was my question, but you answered it. So, another woman, much more famous than Henrietta, of course, Madame du Châtelet, because of all the work that she did. But even so, other than your book and a few other things on Passionate Minds about her and Voltaire, um, the amount of work she did and the brilliance with which she did it
Mhm.
is really a standout in the history of science for female scientists. So
Yes, so
tell a
she
little
had been.
story about, tell us some
Yeah.
stories about those two.
Sure. So I've written two books on Einstein, and in the first one,
Hmm.
there was almost just a few pages about. I discovered there was this woman who had come up with the in the famous equation equals MC squared. There's little number two, the squared,
Hmm.
and the person who came up with that idea, not the full equation, but the squaring being important in physics.
Hmm.
I saw in a little footnote somewhere she was an obscure French thinker from the
Hmm.
1700s, and I thought, how did a woman from 200 years before Einstein come
Yeah.
up with something that this great genius would use? So in one book, I managed to have like a few pages on her. In my first book on Einstein,
Mm.
I thought this is so good. I have to make an entire book about it. So I wrote a book called Passionate Minds, which is all about her. And there was a man who was a bit of a writer who she taught most of what he knew in philosophy and in bed. His name was Voltaire. Voltaire was quick to say that she was the greater part of the partnership.
Mm.
You know the story about Rogers and Hammerstein.
Yeah.
Rogers was asked who was the greater part of their partnership, and he said, "In my case, it was guilt by association." So Voltaire was at one point they were both trying to for a competition set up by the equivalent of the French Royal Society, the Academy of Sciences in Paris. And one summer, Voltaire was trying to do some work on the conservation of energy from the chateau that he and Madame Châtelet shared in northeastern France. And he was working really hard and not getting anywhere. And he just noticed that Madame Emily was looked quite tired during the day. The reason she was tired is she was staying up all night doing her own experiments, and she submitted it anonymously and did much better than him. Um, Voltaire had the typical grace of most men, with when your ego is threatened by a woman who's much more attractive than you and much smarter than you and more ebullient, there's only one thing to do: insult her, have an affair with somebody else, and dump her, which is what Voltaire tried to do. One of the stupidest things in his life. She was a lovely woman. She ended up still doing her scientific research. At one point, she came this close to discovering infrared radiation,
Hmm.
and she even gave a hint about it in some papers in the early 1700s. This is 100 years before Herschel got closer with that in the 1800s. Could you imagine if on the chateau in northeastern France, they had, this is very close to understanding photography also. She was this close to doing it. And unfortunately, as we know, around the world, there's often people with good inventions, but you need a whole machine to turn the invention into reality. You need other people, you need production engineers, you need finance.
Mm.
And in that beautiful chateau that she and Voltaire were at, they didn't have enough equipment for that. It's a lovely story. I remember once reading in the Tatler magazine in England that the actress Anne Hathaway was reading the book and said, "Wow, this is a great story. It should be made into a film. I'm open to that someday." She was really a terrific lady, but it didn't have a happy ending. After she and Voltaire broke up because of his pathetic ego, she became a bit of an alcoholic for a while, and she went off the booze. And unfortunately, she fell in love with this really dashing, much younger French poet. I dedicated this book to my daughter, and I was going to say to my beloved daughter Sophie, "Watch out for French poets." Uh, and the thing is, when you first have a relationship like that, it's the younger person who has extra power because they're fit and all that sort of stuff. But once the relationship goes on for a little while, it switches. So this young poet was saying, "Look, I've done these lovely love poems to you," and she said, "Oh, that's good." She had lived with Voltaire for 10 years.
Yeah.
He was the greatest writer in Europe. And then he said, "Oh, maybe we can go from this small rural place where we are, maybe into Paris." She and Voltaire had been like the pride of Paris. They had a beautiful house at one point on the Ile Saint Louis. And he realized he was being treated poorly. So he did a terrible thing. Well, he did two terrible things. One, as I mentioned, he wrote her some beautiful love poetry, and it really is great. I love translating it. I lived in France, so I could translate it.
Mhm.
It's like the sun upon your bare arm in the morning. My delight is more fresh than the newest. Blah blah blah. The way French people do.
Yeah.
Turned out, she found out later he was recycling his love poems. He had done the exact same poem to another woman 2 years before. Schmuck. But then, anyways, later when she was in her 40s and he was maybe around 30, she got pregnant. And at that time, sadly, it was a death sentence. She knew women who got pregnant later on almost always had, because of the poor medicine of the time. Now it's not necessarily any big deal.
Yeah.
She knew it was really terrible, and she was doing. And he again, he sort of left her. What's nice is she came back with Voltaire.
Mhm.
Their love, in a sense, had become a friendship,
Mhm.
and they just had this beautiful sharing in those last few months. And her pregnancy went well, but she was really worried about what was going to happen. And to make it even worse, she was working on a major translation and reinterpretation of Isaac Newton's work. Newton had written mostly in Latin, the important stuff. She was translating into French, which was the big language on the continent, and developing some of the ideas. She was really a crucial intermediary between the science from the generation before her to the science even 2 or 3 generations later.
Mhm.
And it was really hard, complex work. And Voltaire said she wasn't angry thinking that she was going to die, but she was just sad to feel she would have to leave before she was ready. And like 3 months left, 2 months left, 1 month left, and indeed she died a few days after giving birth.
Mm.
Voltaire was just broken. He used to wander around his house at night, just calling out for his Emily, his leading star. And he was especially broken because he was guilty.
Mhm.
He had sort of driven her away by his weak ego. On the other hand, his great book, many of his works afterwards were either dedicated to her, or if not dedicated to her, he discussed her very much in his writing, and she motivated him from the afterlife. And her writings themselves, she wrote a book called On Happiness, which was written when many of us write books like that, when she was really sad
Mhm.
after Voltaire and before the French poet. And I recommend it.
Great. I mean, it's a great book. And really, I mean, that's how we met. You came here after that book to San Francisco. That's been 15 years, 10 years ago, something like that. So You wrote another book on another topic altogether before we get to your project that you're working on right now. But a little bit of time on the electricity book, because there's another thing. It would be much worse if we lost electricity than the shutdown, for example. I mean, we have
Yeah.
built up this thing, but it's also something very new. It hasn't been that long. You have a great analogy about even 100 years ago, 120 years ago. If you turned off all the electricity, it wouldn't change life very much. But by just 100 years ago, it already was indispensable. And now, the only advantage to turning off the electricity is that AI can't take over.
Right. Yeah. So there's two things about that. Yes, if we knew that 10 years from now electricity would no longer work, we might have a chance of getting other systems in operation.
Yeah.
In 15 or 20 years. It would be really hard, but possibly. If, however, it happened overnight that electricity didn't work at all, like a blackout that nobody fixed, that really would be catastrophic. At the beginning of a blackout, it can be almost fun for the first few minutes. Like,
Hmm.
oh, suddenly you talk to, remember in the old days when we had offices, you speak to your office mates, or at home you get out the candles. And even for a little while, like, oh, don't open the fridge, the cold is going to go out. After a day or two, it becomes less of a joke. The water that the pumps for water for toilets and stuff begins to go. If there was no electricity, that means radios after a while would go, cell phone batteries would go, police wouldn't be able to synchronize. It really would be terrible chaos. Airplanes couldn't take off, fuel couldn't be pumped. It would be it really would be that sound of a everything going down. And it's new, as I was mentioning in the book.
Yeah.
In 1903, 1905, in much of the world, it would have been a slight inconvenience, but no effect. We're really, really tightly bound, as indeed, clearly the internet has bound us in a similar way. I was struck. I suppose a little note for prospective or writers in our audience. I'm pleased that you liked that was the beginning of the book. I imagined the world without electricity would gradually happen,
Yeah.
and then I go even further and imagine suppose electrical forces don't even work. The
Yeah.
mountains would be. It's like the Nina Simone song. The mountains would go down to the sea. The earth would separate apart and stuff. Well, that wasn't the first introduction I wrote. It was agony. I spent about 3 or 4 months trying one introduction after another. I
Mhm.
began with Ted Williams, the batter, who
Uh-huh.
worked on radar and stuff. Dropped that. I did another one where I imagined how curious we look to outer space aliens, these that we're basically assemblages of electrons and other electric particles rambling around the world. I thought that was fairly good. I worked on that for a couple of weeks, dropped it. Only after incredible agony and a real lot of coffee. You remember the definition? Writers are machines for turning coffee into words. Um, Only after that did I come up with it. So I offer to any prospective writers in the audience that if you're really, really struggling, there's a chance there's nothing there, but there is a chance there's something there. You have to make the night's move off to the side and take a
Mhm.
fresh angle. By the way, I suppose it's a deeper principle. The move that I finally came to make the introduction to that book, The Electric Universe, work, I thought of my own father's life. He was old when I was born, so he was aware as a little boy of the world either largely before electricity or when electricity was sort of new and there were other technologies that were powerful. Um, and I've thought about him a lot. He because he was older, he passed away when I was young. So often this night's move, this shift to a new way of acting on things, it won't be random. If
Mm.
somebody says, "Oh, with the coronavirus, your firm has to do something different," or you yourself, or if you're self-employed, needs to do something different. If it's random or you're copying somebody else, it doesn't work. I thought of Ted Williams because I thought, oh, everybody likes baseball, put in a baseball story, and then segue into this. But that wasn't in my heart.
Mm.
Certainly not from his team. I'm a
Yeah.
Chicago Cubs. But I only when I so I say it took several months, but it's only when I looked into my heart and found the aspect of the story that was true to me. I was fascinated with the world of my father. I didn't know him when I was growing up. He passed away when I was 10. I wanted to understand his world. So the writing there came vividly from the heart.
Mm.
And that's a principle that applies in many fields. When you're trying different things, see if there's something that's core inside you that you wish to respond to, that you're drawn to, that you come to over and over. Now, by itself, that could be indulgent. But if you could spin or twist that into something positive, you'll find it's an area that you care about and you will not run out of energy in developing it.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Then you have energy. Then you
Yes.
have a sufficient backing, and it's actually the whole economic value of spreading and decentralizing authority and power and everything like that, and not telling people what to do, is that if you keep everybody afraid and enslaved, well, yeah, you can make them work, but they have no energy for it, and so your whole
Exactly.
society is. And I think we'll learn this, and I have also think that we can create safety nets and all the other stuff that work really well for society, so that we don't lose people because of temporary problems. Then they can have their energy to keep being productive later. But I don't see how any other authoritarian system is going to beat that in a competition. Just like, don't educate the women, don't educate, this, all those
Right.
ideas are ridiculous.
In the short term, just the crank turning out or standard equipment can do well,
Right,
like making, say, a certain tank over and over and over.
right.
But in the long term, this subtlety is very different, and you need a certain amount of that. And the someone like George Orwell thought that that's going to be one of the few chances that can keep society from becoming a dictatorship. However strong a dictatorship is, they'll know they have to at least let a few oddball scientists, maybe financial people, but certainly scientists and engineers and technologists, keep their own standards. Those people have to be able to try different ideas. They have to be a little bit willing to undermine authority and stuff. And of course, they have to follow the reality principle. So those are little nodules or little subsets of both creativity and truth that no society can survive without. In Germany before World War One, the research institutes were conservative, but they weren't. They couldn't be too authoritarian. They realized you had to give a certain amount of space. There's that. Well, in the way that around the world, very often it's at universities that the authorities are worried. Why these people are subversive? But of course, if you entirely close down the universities, you have nothing really strong coming from within. So that tension can be a good thing about science.
I just a couple of weeks ago interviewed Edward Frenkel, a mathematician, teaches here, but he grew up in the Soviet Union. And he said that the
Mhm.
reason they went into math is because it was one of the few things that you could study that you didn't need Marxist-Leninism. They didn't want that. They wanted people who, in physics and math, who could then help them with their weapons. And so they had to learn what was really going on in the world everywhere. And so that was one of the areas for free. And as a result of those kind of things, you do create a set of incentives so that the bright people tend to
Yes.
move towards that. They might not have studied math otherwise, but that's what they study because that's the one place that they can be a little freer. And just
Totally.
like you said,
That's exactly it.
no society can be totally authoritarian. It doesn't ever work, and it should show that it's probably not a good idea at all. I mean, you don't want chaos, obviously. That gets worse. But anyway, we're learning. Time goes by. We keep learning, and electricity is only 100 years old. Democracy is only a couple hundred years old. I hope we'll catch on a little bit more. And I think one of your ideas for this horse chess move or the knight chess move is what you're working on right now. The art of decency, something decency in a world gone mean. People are
Yes.
more afraid. They're being more callous than they've been. But you're investigating and writing. I think it's due out in November for that kind of chess move. And I wonder whether you think this COVID-19 pandemic will help people think that might be a good. Not everybody, obviously. Some people think it's time to be meaner, but the vast majority seem to be cooperative and therefore maybe open to this idea. So tell me what you're working on right now.
Sure, and that's exactly the introduction to it. I've been delighted. I live in London, and I've been delighted at the number of spontaneous community organizations that have come up on the level of individual blocks. People wanting to bring food to old people who are stuck inside, and it's not just my magnificent neighborhood; it's many neighborhoods across the city.
Mm.
In the states, that's been happening a real lot, and so people are saying, "Wow, decency sort of works." Anyway, so the book's called The Art of Fairness.
Mm.
What's the subtitle? Yes, and indeed, what you said, The Power of Decency in a World Gone Mean.
Mm.
And I was struck by the following thing. We know that terrible people can rise to the top. We know that in many organizations, not just politics, but in companies and stuff, all of us have had bosses who were like just total nasty jerks. So we know that can happen and we know that can be successful. So that's one extreme. It's true. Now there's another extreme of the nice guy or the nice woman who's really polite, but they're a bit of a nebbish. They agree with whatever they're asked to do,
Yeah.
and we know that merely being nice won't work. that famous phrase, nice guys finish last, which by the way becomes a chapter in the book, is there's a lot to that. If you're only nice, if you accept what everybody asks you, you'll be pulled in all different directions. That's no good.
Your
So we have
Chicago roots are showing with that one because that's a Leo DeRocher. He was the manager of the Chicago Cubs.
exactly, exactly. You're entirely right. So the one extreme of being a total jerk works, but we don't always want to be like that. And
Yeah.
the other extreme of being really nice and soft, that doesn't work. It's down there. So the question of the book is a simple question: is there a path in between?
Mhm.
Is there a way that you could be successful, not maybe as a quiet scholar off in the corner, that's sort of easy, but in a tough competitive field, like, I don't know, flying an airplane or running a military division or in a big corporation or a huge construction site, something that's hard, competitive, and difficult. Can you find, can you thread that needle? Can you find an intermediate path? And it turns out it's really hard, but you can. And I found about a dozen people, men and women in different periods of time, who did. And I tried to think, how did they do it? What are some of the advantages? Because we know there's many advantages to being a jerk. If you yell and intimidate people, you can often get your way. People get scared.
Right.
You can often also make quick decisions with no compunction. If you have to fire people, you can fire them quickly. So in extreme economic circumstances, there can be certain advantages to that. On the other hand, if you are a jerk, everybody hates your guts. The moment you begin to go down, the knives are really out, at least on your side. Also, people are terrified of you. So usually it's the bossiest person on top who's the most clueless, who's the last one to know what's really going on. Well, again, leaving aside the soft, nice guy, but the intermediate person, you know that phrase, firm but fair. I suppose
Yeah.
that's what the book's about. That person, they get fresh information comes to them. People aren't terrified. They're firm enough to be able to make a decision afterwards. So they'll be generous. Instead of getting resentment back, they'll get gratitude. But of course, they're not naive. So running through the book, I point out that these 7 or 8 or 10 successful people I talk about, they all have street smarts. They say you can be really generous, but you got to audit what's coming back. Just make sure there's not a handful of free riders who are taking advantage of you.
Mhm.
And I was delighted to find that it works, be it in small areas like an airplane cockpit,
Mm.
going all the way to huge international relations.
It's really, really a great topic. Um, shall we finish? We're up with something on Einstein. I mean, you wrote another book just on the equation E equals mc squared and how that was the second book on Einstein that you worked on. Um, which one came first? Einstein E
Oh,
equals mc squared came first, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
The reason for that is I remember seeing something by Stephen Hawking, who
Uh-huh.
said that if you put an equation in a book, the sales go down by half. And I thought, let's see. Let's see what let me bring it on. Let me challenge Steve. Come on, Stephen, bring it on. So I thought, what if I put an equation on the title? Let's challenge that. Um, and
Did he know that you challenged him this way and won or not?
uh, in fact, when I was young, I had the great honor of meeting Stephen Hawking.
Uh-huh.
I was doing relativity at Chicago, and he was in the mid 1970s. And he came at that point. I think he walked with a stick.
Uh-huh.
And what's often misunderstood from his later life, sort of what you were saying about Einstein, he was funny. There's a type of very ironic, dry-witted British guy in his 20s or 30s, and that was Hawking. So he had a lovely, wry, dry sense of humor. He was, in that sense, a good guy. Anyways, yeah. So the first book was about equals MC squared, and I wanted to again tying in with you often write well when there's deep principles.
Mm.
I'd often wondered what was the underlying reality that my late father could see and that I could see also, even though I couldn't see him. The French poet Saint-Exupéry
Yep.
once said, "Love isn't looking in each other's eyes; it's looking together in the same direction." And I find that really beautiful. So when I was young, I used to look up at the sky or think about people. And I thought, oh, I wonder what did my dad make of those things? I would never know.
Mm.
So I became fascinated with trying to understand things that sort of surround our world that we can all access at different times. And one of the most famous ones is the ideas of relativity and all these ideas of physics. And I thought describing all that's really hard. I didn't want to just summarize the textbooks I'd studied when I was younger.
Mm.
But I thought, what if I could take one aspect? What if I could take the most famous equation in the world, equals mc squared, and how can I make that interesting for people? So one way people try to do it is in a friendly way with jokes and stuff, summarize a textbook. That wasn't going to work.
Mm.
The other way that people try to do is they humanize the individuals, which is along with the science. You tell a funny story about Einstein or his clothes, but that wouldn't work either. It's a distraction. So then I thought, what if I could find a way to make the equation itself the thing that's the biography about? I think subtitle the biography of an equation. And what if I could find like the essence of Einstein for that? So anyway, so I used that equation to carry along. The story was carried along. Where did this equation come from? What was its birth like? Did it have a difficult adolescence? What happened when it grew up? And then
Mm.
you become intrigued.
And it was very intriguing. It was a great way of showing how the equation, especially all the effects of it, and how everybody used it, and how it was always going on the whole time. But it was a great insight into something that people take. And I should not probably ask you such a difficult question as the last one, but so the speed of light squared. I mean, how can something go faster than the speed of light?
Ah, um, So this is a good question. Were I better, I could answer while standing on one foot. Instead, I shall answer sitting in the chair in London. Um, the equation equals mc squared. The way of thinking of it, for the moment, forget the c squared. Just say there's E on one side, which stands for energy, and m on the other, which stands for mass. So suppose I'm holding a piece of paper in my hand. That's a little bit of mass, and the question is, how much energy is inside it? We know that if you burn it with put a match to it, a certain amount of energy comes out.
Mm,
And but we also know that if you break apart the atoms inside, even more energy comes out.
mm,
So the question is, how much energy is in there? So there's some relation between energy and mass. We know that coal, for example, like a pound of coal produces more energy than say a pound of I don't know, a pound of paper. And I'm guessing a pound of gunpowder would produce even more. So there's some relation fundamentally between energy and mass. So you need an exchange rate.
mm.
So, for example, there's a relation between pounds and dollars. I don't know
Right.
what the relation is, 1.3 or something. There's a relation between Fahrenheit and centigrade or between yen and dollars. So you need an exchange rate. And it turns out Einstein thought about it. And for reasons for which you would have to buy the book, he realized that the exchange rate is a certain number.
Mm,
And it isn't like a little bit of mass becomes a little bit of energy. It's like a little bit of mass becomes a huge amount of energy.
right.
So the exchange rate isn't like 2 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. It isn't even 1,000,000 to 1. It's much bigger. I mean, this depends on the unit you're using, but the idea holds. And for various technical reasons, he found that the exchange rate, the amount of how much energy you'll get out from a certain amount of mass, you take the amount of mass you have and you multiply by this huge number to get the energy.
Mm.
I think I give the image of imagine there's somebody riding a bicycle into a tunnel. And when they come out of the other side, it's not a slightly bigger bicycle. It's a huge, enormous Airbus 380 airplane coming out. So what's the multiplier? What's the multiplier there? And it turns out it's the speed of light is in miles an hour is about 670 million miles an hour. So if you take say 1 unit of mass and multiply it by 670 million, you get a lot of energy. Turns out if you take the speed of light and square it, you get a humongous number, 670 million squared. I know I'm playing around with units, but again, the idea holds. So in the equation, it's E equals m times this really big number. So to find out how much energy you get from a little bit of mass, such as uranium or plutonium, such as the uranium, which was dropped over Japan in 1945, you take that little bit of mass, those few grams of mass. If you turn that into energy, you don't multiply it by 3 or by 5 or by 1,000. You multiply it by this huge number, which is summarized by the symbol c squared.
Yeah.
And in fact, the fulcrum of the book is the dropping of the atomic bomb over Japan in 1945.
Hmm.
The flash was so powerful, just a few grams of matter went out of existence. A few grams of matter were turned into energy. The flash hit the moon and bounced back.
Hmm. Hit the moon and bounce back. And it's a great image. And in addition to that, um, it makes it very clear that we don't really have an energy crisis because we have lots of mass that we could turn into energy. It's just a knowledge crisis. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do it safely? If you're a futurist, how we deal with energy, how far we get past electricity, how far we move with other things is going to make our future almost incomprehensible to us in the
I,
21st
I
century.
suppose maybe circling back to what you were saying at the beginning about the virus,
Yeah.
I think the key lesson that people learned in 1945 was that you could transform society.
Mm.
In Britain or in America, you could take several million healthy young men out of society, put them overseas in war, and yet the society is richer and the factories are working better than ever before.
Mm.
There's more food, there's more equipment. How could that happen? So remember, suppose how long has this been? 2 months? Suppose 3 months ago somebody said, George, I know what we can do. We can have almost all the cars in San Francisco stop driving and air pollution could go down substantially. Or we can stop the airplanes flying. You say, yeah, 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 right, as if that's going to happen.
Right.
We've now shown that you can. So clearly that particular solution isn't stable. We've now shown, wow, you can do these sorts of things. Or you can take certain investments from the future and make them out as cash transfers today.
Mhm.
You have to do it well, but these are things that nobody ever thought could be done. So for a little while, we have this immense sense of, I don't want to say mastery because that's arrogant, but an awareness that, wow, we really can transform the world. We really, if we put our minds to it, can do extraordinary things. Let's hope we're led in the right direction to do these extraordinary things.
Yes, we're not stuck. We need good leadership. Thanks for providing a lot of the insight that is helpful to the leadership if they'll read. So thank you very, very much, David. That was just great. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion.